Today, we're going to regain control over our sign-ins and authentication. No more leaving sites wide open, no more single-factor authentication. We're going all in with authentication and authorization for our self-hosted services. And we're going to secure them with single sign-on and two-factor authentication. We're going to use an open source product called Authelia, which acts as a companion for reverse proxies like nginx or Traefik or HA proxy. It allows us to sign in once and gain access to all of our services securely. And it supports several second-factor auth methods like YubiKey or TOTP, time-based one-time passwords with Google Authenticator or Auth, and even mobile push notifications using something like Duo. And if you can't or don't want to support two-factor authentication, it can still support one-factor, and it even supports basic authentication for endpoints. And just recently, it started supporting OpenID Connect too. It also supports password resets using identity verification by sending confirmation emails. And we can restrict access after too many failed attempts to stop brute force attackers in their tracks. And because it's open source and actively developed, the feature list continues to grow. And believe it or not, we can get all this running in just a couple of minutes. Also, I'm going to share my entire configuration with you with everything that I've learned about Authelia over the last couple of weeks. And if that sounds good to you, give this video a thumbs up and let's continue to configure Authelia. So, how do we get started? We're going to set this up using Docker and Portainer and Traefik. I recently created a video on Docker, Portainer, and Traefik and how to secure all of your services with wildcard certificates. So if you need help setting that up, I'll leave a link in the description for you. But even if you're not going to use Authelia, most of this guide will still apply because Authelia supports many different reverse proxies. And so you'll want to make sure that your reverse proxy is up and running. Then we can hop right in. So Authelia has three types of configurations. They call them bundles. The first configuration is a local configuration. This type of configuration is for something that you would use behind the firewall. It uses minimal to no configuration, and it doesn't use DNS at all. But it also means that self-signed certificates will be used. So this isn't a good choice for us. The next one is the light bundle. Now this can be used for machines that are exposed directly to the internet. This is going to be a good option for home lab users. And then there's the full bundle. Now this is like the light bundle, except for it's going to use a different type of storage on the back end. With the full option, you have options like MySQL, Postgres, and MariaDB. And if you already have one of those databases running in your environment, this is probably a good choice for you. But in my environment, to keep it simple, I'm going to go with the light option. And this is easy to swap out later, so just follow along. Next, we'll need to create a Docker Compose file so we can instantiate this container on one of our servers. Now, in their Traefik example, you can see here that they're using both services. They actually have a third service in here called Nextcloud. In this example, they combined all of these services into one stack, which is great for a demo, but not great for me. I like to keep most of my Compose files separate so that I can spin these up without all of the dependent services spinning up at the same time too. So we're going to break this apart and make this a little bit easier. But the idea is still the same, because in this example, they have a reverse proxy. Here they're using Traefik. And they apply the image, the container name, a volume, network, labels, ports, commands, all the normal stuff you would see on Traefik or your reverse proxy. Then they define the service Authelia. And this is what we're going to focus on today. And in here, they define their image, the container name, a volume, which is a path to their config, a network they define, and then some labels. And in these labels is where the magic happens. But we'll talk about that here in a second. And then next, they defined another containerized workload, which is Nextcloud. And this looks like your typical Nextcloud deployment, except for one thing. This line right here, this label, Traefik, HTTP, routers, Nextcloud, middlewares, Authelia, add Docker. And this is telling this container to use this middleware, Authelia, add Docker, which is a service we defined above. So this is all great for examples, but let's break it down and make it a little bit easier and separate this configuration so that you don't have to deploy one gigantic YAML file. So here's what our Docker Compose file looks like just for Authelia. And remember, I'll have links to this file and all of these files in the description in a documentation link, so be sure and check that out. But you can see here, this is a typical Docker Compose file. We're using version 3, we defined a service called Authelia. It's using the image of Authelia/Authelia. We're using the tag of latest since we haven't defined anything. We're naming this container Authelia, and then we're mapping some volumes. So we're telling the container to mount this path config to the containers path of config. Then we're defining a network called proxy. Now this network name needs to match the same name that Traefik is using for its network, which I've called proxy. So make sure that matches. And then we're going to define some labels, and these are all for Traefik. So we're enabling Traefik on this container. We're creating a route on this container, and we're saying that the host name is auth.local.technotim.live. Now, how did I come up with this name? Well, I just came up with it. Now, I own this domain, and this is going to be my auth endpoint that's available to all of my machines here internally. Now, this can be an external endpoint too, but you'll have to make sure of a couple things. One, you'll have to make sure that this DNS entry exists. If you're doing this internally, this will be on your internal DNS. So if you're using Pi-hole, you would create a DNS entry to an auth endpoint. If you're using external DNS, you would have to create an external record that points back to this reverse proxy, which is my number 2. This DNS record should point to your reverse proxy. It should point to wherever Traefik is. And the name can be whatever you'd like it to be. It could be login, it could be sign in, but I've just called mine auth. And this will be where Authelia is hosted. And these other labels are typical Traefik ones too. Use HTTPS, TLS is true, and these next ones are defining our middleware. So here we're saying use the middleware from Authelia and the middleware called forward auth, and the address is defined as this URL right here. So if you look at the end of this address, it looks familiar. It's the same address for our auth endpoint. So this is all you'll need to change. But this is basically saying, hey, use the forward auth middleware from Authelia when you get an authentication request. And we're gonna redirect you to Authelia on 9091/API/verify and then specify our auth hostname. And this Authelia right here, I think is defined from the service name here. So if you have Authelia there, you're gonna need it here too, or vice versa. And the next two are just middleware properties for forward auth. So trust forward header equals true, and auth response equals remote user, remote groups, remote name, remote email. So these all need to be set. And here's the port we were saying, 9091, that looks familiar here. And then we're gonna say restart it unless stopped, and then we're gonna set an environment variable. So time zone is America/Chicago for me, update this for you. Then we're specifying a health check and we're disabling it, equals true. We probably don't even need this, but this is included with their example. And then we're defining that network too that we defined above. So networks, proxy, external equals true. And so with this, we could spin up our container, but we need a little bit of configuration. And we want that in place before we spin up this container for the first time. So what does that configuration look like? Well, it looks like this. Now, this can be a little overwhelming, but this is their example with only a few values changed. And so I'll cover some of the highlights and let's go through this. So we're saying the host is any IP on any interface. We're specifying the port is 9091. We're setting the log level to debug. Next is theme, and we're setting this to dark because why not dark mode? But it supports 3 themes, light, gray, and dark. And I think it's light by default. So if you want dark mode, add this here. If you want gray, set gray. And if you want light, just don't specify anything at all. And next is our JWT secret, or our JOT, or JSON web token. You want to make this very secure, long, and I think up to 64 characters. You can also mount this with the secret file here too. And I think if you don't specify it, it'll generate one for you. But you want to make sure that this is a super complex and long string and don't share it with anyone. Next is your default redirection URL. For the time being, you could set this to where Authelia is hosted on your network. So I've just set mine to auth.local.technotim.live. But update this with your value. And TOTP, so our time-based one-time password. We want to set the issuer to authelia.com. Next is our authentication backend. And remember, if I said if we're using the light version, we can use a file-based backend, which is a lot simpler than the alternatives, which are database backends. And this is great for home lab use or in an environment where you only have a few users. But once you get above a few or 10, you'll want to switch to a database. Doesn't make any sense to manage it in YAML after that. But for us, and for me, I only have one user on my network that's going to use this, so I'm going to use the file-based approach. And so we're going to use the file backend with a path to the user database. And the user database is just a YAML file, which is another file we'll need, which is our user database. And so this users underscore database YAML file is right here. Now, this is just an example one, and we specify our users here, but I'm saying that I have a user called Authelia, and my display name is Authelia user, and my password specified here, my email specified here, and these are the groups that this user belongs to. So let's update this a little bit. So I'm gonna say my user is Techno Tim. I'm gonna say my display name is also Techno Tim, and then my password. What's my password? Well, let's go back to our configuration really quick, because our configuration has a password specified too. This password is using an algorithm called Argon2ID. So Argon2ID, I learned, is a password hashing algorithm. And I think they support a few different algorithms, but this is the most popular one, and this is the one that they recommend. And here are some of the properties that they recommend for hashing your password. Now, these can be changed or tweaked, but I would definitely look at their documentation before changing some of these. So how do we actually hash this password using this algorithm now? As you can see, this one looks hashed to me. Well, in their documentation, they've conveniently supplied a Docker container that can hash your password for you using their algorithm. So this is super nice. So all we need to do is paste this command in our terminal. Then we'll want to update this with our password. Don't use this password. And then this container will actually hash the password for us. And it's right here. So we can copy this value and put it into our database, this YAML file. Then you'll want to update your email address for this user, and then you'll want to specify groups that they're in. So I'm going to stay in the default group of admins and dev. And so if you had more users, you would just duplicate this here, change the username, generate a new password, update the email address, and paste it there. Okay, so back to our configuration, now that we have a user created. Next, we're going to set the access control. And this is an access control policy for all of your routes. And we're going to keep this really, really simple. And we're going to say the default policy is to deny, and then we're going to apply some rules. And so we have three different types of policies. One, we have bypass, which doesn't have any authentication at all. Next, we have one factor, which is one factor, just your password. And then we have two factor, which in our case, it's going to be the one-time password or Auth or Google Authenticator. And so here you'll want to add the domains you want protected and how you want to protect them. For example, in this public.example.com, I don't need any authentication. This is going to be wide open in public access. This would be like a public website. The next domain in my example is Heimdall. So I use Heimdall as a dashboard here, and I want to say that, hey, Heimdall has one-factor authentication, so password only. And then next, my next domain, this PVE1, is my Proxmox server. I want to make that a little more secure, so I'm going to say that this requires two factors, so not only the password, but the time-based one-time password as well. And as you add more domains here, you can specify the policy that they fall into. So in the session section, we're only going to change a couple of things. So a session is how long your auth tokens last, or how long before you'll be prompted to sign back in. We're going to keep most of the default settings, but we will need to change the domain. This domain has to match the domain that you're protecting. So here I'm going to put technotim.live, so update this with your domain. The next section is for Redis, and we're actually not going to use Redis. But if you were going to use this in, say, HA mode, you would probably need Redis to store these sessions on some other type of storage. But since we're only using one, we can actually comment this whole section out. So the next section is regulation, and this is to stop brute force attacks. So in here, we're saying that anyone can retry up to 3 times with the wrong password. It's gonna search back or seek 120 seconds back, so 2 minutes, and look for those failed attempts. And if it finds them, then it's gonna ban for 300 seconds or 5 minutes. And so these are pretty sensible defaults. If you'd like to change them, feel free to, but I'm gonna keep mine at the default. So the next section is storage, and I mentioned if we were using the full bundle, we would have a lot more storage options. But since we're using the light bundle, the only storage option we have is SQLite. And this is fine for a small setup like mine in a home lab, or if you only have a few users, SQLite will do just fine. But if you wanted to use a different storage provider, here's where you'd swap it out. And notifier, so this one can be pretty complicated. but it's really going to be up to you. So this is the service that will send out notifications for password resets. If you forget your password and need to reset it, this will be the service that will send an email to the email address you provided in the users section. And as you can see, this isn't configured right now for SMTP to actually send an email. You can do this in a couple of ways. If you use Gmail or any other mail provider, most of them provide a way to send an email through their SMTP server so that you can get the password reset email. And you'll want to fill in the details here. But then there are also third-party free services like Mailgun or any other provider like that will allow you to use their SMTP server to send the email out for the password reset. And if you're going to use one of those services, you would do the same thing. Fill in your credentials, fill in the host, the port, and the sender that the email's from. And that will allow you to get that email, click on the link, and reset your password through Authelia. But there's one more option. You don't want to configure email at all, and this is a small installation. You can actually configure a local provider that will write the notification to disk so that you can look at it. Now, this should not be used long term, and it's definitely not scalable. You don't want to SSH into this machine every time and look at this text file to get a link, to click on that link to reset your password. But it's here in a pinch. And so I'll show you what that looks like. It looks like this. So basically, instead of configuring SMTP, we're going to configure the file system notifier with a file name that's written out to /config and notification.txt. Now, you can use this while you're setting it up and before you decide on which mail provider you're going to use to send out this email, or you can use it here forever so that you don't have to send those reset emails through someone else's mail server. But I'd recommend going the email route when you can. So that was a lot of configuration, I know, but I think it warranted the time we put into it so that you understand how to configure this service and spin it up. And so that's all there is that's left to do, at least to get Authelia going. Let's spin it up. So you want to remote into the server that's running Portainer or running Docker that's also running your reverse proxy. And then once you're in there, create a folder called config. Then we'll want to create a file called configuration.yaml. And in that file, we're going to paste the config that we talked about a little bit earlier. Again, that file is in my GitHub and there's a link in the description. So we'll paste our config there. Then we'll save it. Then we'll create our user database, which is just this YAML file. So we'll create a YAML file, user_database.yaml, and in here we'll paste the contents of our user database YAML file. Then we'll save that. So inside of our config folder, we should have these two files now, configuration.yaml and user_database.yaml. So let's go one directory up. Then we'll create our Docker compose file. And in here, we're going to paste the contents of that Docker compose file we created earlier. We'll save it, close out of here, and now we should be able to bring Authelia up. So we're going to run this command, docker-compose up-d. And what that did was pull Authelia down and then spin it up. So now you're thinking, okay, how do I make sure it's working? To make sure it's working, you can go to the auth endpoint that we created earlier for Authelia. So in my case, it was auth.local.technotim.live. And when we go here, we can see a sign-in screen. So this is a great sign. This means that Authelia is up and working. But so far, we only have Authelia running. Don't get me wrong, that's a huge accomplishment. But we haven't protected any endpoints yet or any web services. Right now, we just have a sign-in screen that we can sign into and get authenticated and redirected back to this authentication page, which isn't really protecting anything at all. So to start protecting endpoints, we only need to do a couple of things. So for containers that are already hosted on this same machine, it's super easy. For example, I have Heimdall hosted on this machine. It's heimdall.local.technotim.live. And my Heimdall is using a pretty standard Docker compose file. It's already configured for Traefik, so it's going through my reverse proxy and has certificates. So to add Authelia to this container that's running on the same machine, I just have to add one line. So I add another label. And this one line that I'm adding is basically just adding middleware. And it's saying use the middleware, Authelia, at Docker. So I should be able to just add this one line, save it, and then recreate this container, and then refresh this page. And there we go. Now we're protected with Authelia. And I should be able to just sign in. And there we go. We're protected with Authelia. Now, why didn't I get the time-based one-time password prompt? Well, let's check our config. So if we go back to our configuration, we're saying that this domain is only protected with one factor and not two. And we're saying that our Proxmox server is protected with two-factor. And so now we'll cover how you protect an endpoint that's not a container that we defined in our Traefik route. And that also is really simple to do. It's right here. So in our Traefik config, we've provided some routes. And this is the route on how I get to my Proxmox server. So I'm saying it's this IP address maps to this host name. And so when Traefik sees a request for this host name, it's gonna send it to this IP address and protect it with a certificate. So we need to add some middleware. What middleware do we need to add? We need to add Authelia middleware. And so here we've defined our middlewares. So we're gonna add one item of middleware for Authelia. And we're saying the Authelia middleware for the property forward auth, and then the property address is the address of Authelia server. And then all we need to do is add that to our middlewares for this route. So let's go back into our server and let's modify this config file for Traefik on our server. And let's add this middleware here. And a note, you'll want this middleware to be first. So order matters here. And you'll almost always want this first. So just make sure it's first. And then we haven't defined this middleware yet. So let's add it right here. And so now we've defined this middleware, saying Authelia, the forward auth property, the address property, is the URL of our server. Okay, so let's save that. Let's recreate our Traefik container. So now it should have the middleware. And once we go there, we're prompted for our one-time password. Now, why didn't we get prompted for our first factor? Well, that's because we already have a session. So if we log out of here and we go back to our Proxmox server, now you can see we're getting prompted for our password. So that's the cool thing about sessions and getting single sign-on, is that we're authenticated for that whole entire domain, so anything you protect behind that domain has the cookie and the session already. So let's sign back in. And now we need to register our one-time password. So we can register by clicking on this link below, and it's saying it sent an email to us. So if you configured SMTP, it should be there. You should have an email in your inbox. But we didn't configure SMTP, we did file-based, so let's go look at that notification. So back on our server, we'll go into the Authelia folder and then config, do an ls, and we see we have a notifications text. If we edit that, we should see the notification email in a text file. So we should be able to go to this URL and see a QR code. And now we can scan this QR code, click done, enter our password, and now we're authenticated. And now we should be able to get to our Proxmox server. That's pretty awesome, sorry. I'm still amazed by this. This is new to me, so let me bask in this glory of single sign-on and one-time passwords. But that's pretty awesome. I'm thoroughly impressed. I'm speechless. And so you can see how powerful this is. And at the same time, you can see how easy this is. It's super duper easy once you get it set up to add additional endpoints to be able to protect. And now I know I did this with internal sites, but that really doesn't matter. You can protect external sites as well. If you're already exposing your reverse proxy, it's as simple as just adding additional labels, adding some configuration, and adding some routes to be able to have two-factor auth on some of your endpoints. Authelia makes it really easy to protect services that are running on that Docker host, as well as any other service that's behind your reverse proxy. And again, it supports more reverse proxies than just Traefik. So what do you think of Authelia? Are you gonna protect any of your endpoints behind one-factor, two-factor auth? Are you gonna configure push notification? What services do you use that can actually use Authelia in front of it? If you are going to, or not, let me know in the comments section below. And remember, if you found anything in this video helpful, don't forget to like and subscribe. Thanks for watching.
Antithenes, how's the hair? All right.
hair reveal. It's kind of wild. Well, this is what I'm working with right now. It is so wild right now, like I can't even do anything with it. And so I've had curly hair like my whole life, and I've been shaving it for a while. And I just let it grow. I'm just letting it grow. I'm just figuring it out. Every time I need a haircut, I ask my wife, hey, you got a second? You want to try to cut my hair, try something new? And so we do. And so lately it's just been like cutting it and shaving it and making it less wild.